Welcome to Citizen AYNE, the podcast where the industries of sport and media intersect. Never before has it been so necessary to understand this symbiotic partnership as the entire content and entertainment sectors disrupt at pace, led by ever more ambitious moguls. The reference to the Orson Welles masterpiece is therefore no coincidence. The show is brought to you by our friends at 54, themselves at the forefront of change in so many sport formats and models. 54 brings a unique and proven capability to align capital, strategy and execution capabilities for investors, most recently in golf, polo and paddle. 54 and Citizen AYNE, the perfect match.
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of. You know, Mr. Bernstein, if I hadn't been very rich, I might have been a really great man.
Don't you think you are?
I think I did pretty well under the circumstances.
I'm Roger Mitchell, and this is Citizen AYNE. This is a new show that's inspired by a film made 85 years ago about a media mogul called Charles Kane. The sports industry for the last 40 years has been pretty much dominated by people like Charles Kane. And their names were John Malone, Silvio Berlusconi, Rupert Murdoch. And today's no different. The names have just changed to Ellison, Bezos, even an Elon Musk. And these people and what they're going to do have always dominated the sports industry. And even more so today because both the media sector and the sports sector are going through quite a lot of disruption, or what people like to call more softly transformation. I like to call it disruption. And that's what Citizen AYNE is all about. And when I thought about the show and why I'm using the word we, I felt I couldn't do it on my own. I wanted a co-host, but somebody I knew all about and somebody that I go back quite a long time with. And the natural name was the legendary Mark Oliver. Mark and I met in 1998-99 when I was at the Scottish Premier League and he was advising us. But Mark is known to everybody in the industry, intelligent, erudite, authoritative, across all kinds of clients. He's worked for rights holders, worked for broadcasters and investors. And I'm very, very lucky that he's agreed to join me on this adventure. Mark Oliver, welcome.
Hello, Roger. Always a pleasure.
Listen, my friend, we're going to get right into this, but I want to ask you something. You don't do a lot of podcasts. You don't do an awful lot of what people now call content or content marketing or putting a lot of things out. Why Citizen AYNE and why now, and what are you wanting to get out of this?
Why now? I think given what you described as a transformation or every revolution, inversion, whatever we call it in media, I think we need to, it's very good for people to understand what's going on in each other's industries. So I think it's very useful for people in sport to understand what's going on in the media and tech platforms, and vice versa, tech platforms and media need to understand what's changing in sport, because quite a lot is changing in sport, not least new investors coming in. Why I decided to do a podcast and decided to do more content output? I think because I do comments on LinkedIn, I do short pieces on LinkedIn, etc., but not many, as you say. But I welcome the chance to kind of take a step back and give an overview, and also to have a format where we can interview other people and they can give their views, because I think you always learn things rather than just being a kind of broadcaster of my opinions. So it was quite a good time to do it. Good time to step back, good time to hear from people on the front line, so to speak. And I think it will be useful at this particular point in time for there to be more mutual understanding, at the very least.
And I think when you say mutual understanding, it's fair to say that you and I probably aren't always so aligned on our visions for the media sector and hence the values of media rights. But we'll get into that, I'm sure, today, where we don't have a guest. It's just you and I setting the scene. This is the pilot episode. And I think the best way to do that is to tell people how we met, because the circumstances of how we met, I think, are very educational for what can happen in the sector and these dynamics, this symbiotic relationship between sport and media. In 1999, I was the chief executive of the Scottish Premier League. And we were in a moment where it seemed as if the value of media rights, the strength of sport as content and as a driver for platforms was never higher. We had new entrants come into the market that were called ITV Digital, NTL. We had mobile operators starting to bid for rights because the 3G licenses had been sold by the British government and exorbitant amounts of money. It was all go, go, go. It was very much a bull market. And I came to you in 1999 and said, look, we've still got 3 years to run on our rights, but I think we need to ride this wave. Can you help me? Because I've got no shame in saying that I was very much a novice in terms of how the media sector worked. Do you want to take on the story from there to explain what happened, Mark?
Yes, well, obviously 1999 we were in the white heat of the dot-com boom. So it wasn't just media that was kind of hyped up. It was really the future, the dot-com future. And many of the things predicted in 1999, 2000 happened. Unfortunately, it happened in 2025, not in 2002. So some of those business plans take a long time to come through. I can see many things I see now are almost exactly the business plans I saw then, but they are more realistic now. They're reality rather than. So there was a kind of tidal wave of investment. I wouldn't say hype, but investment bets. Everyone can be a winner. People start bidding up the price of shares of all media and tech companies. They're not quite sure which one's going to win, but everyone. And there's a kind of feedback loop because the tech companies, and I remember saying this actually to the people at Yahoo at the time. Yahoo, people forget what that was, but that was a big player at the time. I asked a question which I was told never to ask again, which was how much of your advertising revenue comes from other tech firms who've just got a lot of funding?
Oh,
and I
wow.
was told, don't answer that question. So we had a boom on a boom. People with lots of investment money were trying to get market share quickly, spending money on .com platforms and ITV and commercial broadcast.
That almost sounds like the circular relationship between the AI companies and the chip manufacturers today is eerily similar.
Yeah. So we had everybody booming on the back of each other's investment monies, which were raised on the back of a boom, which was self-fulfilling until it wasn't. And that was the background to 1999, 2000. You also had, at this time, you had a mad rush from media companies to own sports. If you remember, Sky had tried to buy Man United and been knocked back by the Competition Commission that said you can't own more than 9.9%. Then Granada, who I was working for, had got Liverpool, and that led to a complete bun fight around the country, literally a race around the country to sign up clubs. And so it wasn't just that media was having high valuations, .coms having high valuations, but sports assets themselves are suddenly the route to the future. The same arguments as now. Get something that is a passion vertical that drives interest, and you can build a .com business on top of it. So you've got at least three levels of boom going on there, and that's the context to which we met. And as you said, it looked like things were good. Lots of competitors, high valuations, and that was the context for us doing it. Of course, roll forward. It will go back to exactly what happened, but roll forward to, I'm trying to think what month it was. I think it was late spring 2001. The .com boom became a .com crash. And after that date, very soon after that date, you couldn't get anybody interested in anything at all. It was quite an interesting period for my own business, which I had to ride out for about the next 3 years. But effectively, it went from boom to complete bust really quickly. Ironically, and this is a bit of macroeconomics for you, the authorities were so worried that the bust would cascade into the rest of the economy. Sound familiar? They loosened monetary policy very, very quickly. And so what happened was the the telecoms and sort of tech and media sector went through a massive downturn, but the economy didn't. So people in the economy in general probably say, what's the problem? But if you're in the media or in tech industry, you had a big problem. So it was a rather unusual feeling that you were suffering. Sometimes it's okay if you're suffering if you feel everybody else is suffering. But if you suffer and no one else is, you feel like the idiot.
Yes.
And there was that kind of attitude around that we seem to be the only people who've gone through a complete bust. And that was kind of, as you would say, that was the end of our work, because that was going on in the background. So when we started the work for you, there was a huge demand for the rights, and it was a question of how high the price could be, what were the alternatives. And by the end of it, there were no alternatives, and everybody had missed the bus. And I think you know what the political consequences in the sport were of that, Roger.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because you said to me once, and it's true, people say it often, what are leagues? What is the glue around any sports league, certainly any football league? Ultimately, their main task is the media contract. Beyond that, they go back to their old role of rules and regs and fixtures. The reason is that it's easier and more efficient to sell a league's rights centrally as opposed to club by club. Many European leagues learned that over the years and all went to the central model. So when you think about it, the real role of any league, and that includes the EPL, let's be very honest, is to maximise their media revenues. So I thought, going early and riding the wave was the right thing. What you then did, Mark, which was truly educational for me, is that you broke down our assets, i.e. our events, our games, and translated them into a monetary valuation through the mechanics of your knowledge and skills and knowing how the advertising market works, how subs work and everything like that. And it was very, very interesting to see not only the total that you came up with, but how it was made up. For example, the value of an Old Firm game versus the value of Kilmarnock versus Motherwell. That probably, that detail of work probably had its demise in its own excellence, if I can make that point. And I hear you laughing here, because you came up with a...
Tell them what they're worth, is that right, Roger?
Don't ever tell them what they're worth, because they will ask to get that. All leagues, the other point about all football leagues is that the big franchises, the big clubs finance the rest in the central contract. But if you show them how that is made up, they all of a sudden can unsee that. I, in my naivety as a young man at that time, thought the truth is the truth, and doing a good, transparent job is what is needed. I will get Mark Oliver to value our rights at something that came up significantly higher than our incumbent contract at the time. I showed my clubs and said, we need to sell our rights now, not when they're coming up in 3 years' time. A little bit like the NFL is thinking of doing today. You go when you need to go. That was the right decision by me. What was the wrong decision was showing the clubs that report from you. And then we spent, as a league, a year, if not 18 months, having Celtic and Rangers point out to all the lines in the report that said they generated 60 to 70, if not more, % of the entire value of the contract, whereas they were only taking out between them 34%. They were arguing over 30 points of margin of split. And that argument went on so long that they ran into what you just described earlier, which was not only the dot-com bust, but that was shortly followed by the Twin Towers and a full-blown media recession, lack of confidence, etc., etc. And for me, that was terminal, because we then only had one bidder. Everybody else had left. Sky was left. They bid the same amount, i.e. they kept us the same level as the existing contract, which they felt was a very good bid and a generous bid given that we had nowhere else to go. But my clubs, again, couldn't unsee the value that they had thought they were worth at the time. And they said to me to knock it back and go and do our own channel, which, and this is in 2000, 2001, 25 years ago. It hadn't really been heard of then. And we did that. We worked it up. I won't go into that story. It's been told a few times. But the point being is that Celtic and Rangers then voted against that at the end of the day. And we got ourselves into the kind of mess that the French league is in now. And from that, Mark, I wanted to tell this because that leads us on to my question in this pilot episode, to the both of us really. In the 25 years since then, what are the lessons that you yourself have learned about this crazy industry of ours, media and sport and sports rights? What are the things that are written, like carved into your hearts? What are the scars on your back?
Well, I mean, now you mentioned the presentations, etc. There is one, I think, which comes to mind just to mind now, which is never look too clever in front of football people. I to this day remember trying to explain the theory of optimal price discrimination to the assembled heads of football clubs, and it was, as they say, it was the tumbleweed of whatever the Glasgow Empire was coming up. I didn't get pies thrown at me or worse, but it was just that. So don't ever get too clever in front of. I mean, you can be clever, but don't ever kind of get too clever. But beyond that, I think, as you said, timing is the big lesson. Is that whatever you say about valuation models, etc., a lot of the numbers that go in are about what people believe at the time. And there are times when people are very optimistic and sometimes too optimistic. And there are times where people get too pessimistic, they overreact. And if you get the wrong cycle of that, both in terms of the general economy, the general market, or in terms of how many competitors you have, which is kind of a function of the same thing, because when things are bad, weaker competitors kind of drop out or go bust. If you have time with that wrong, it can make a huge difference to the deal you do, especially if you're doing a fixed deal. Of course, the other lesson from On Digital, which I was part of, although I can explain that their bid was nothing to do with me, was get parent company guarantees if you are accepting a bid. I still have a document in my files, which is the original heads of terms between Carlton, Granada and the Football League, with the parent guarantees crossed out. So it was in the contract and it came out. Again, I had not part of that. It came to me as part of the legal proceedings after the case. But I also discovered that the On Digital had doubled the amount I suggested they pay without consulting me. I'd used my model and put new inputs in saying, we've used the O&O model, and this is what we're going to bid, but I wasn't in that meeting. So when they actually did bid, and I was sitting in a meeting, I was sitting in a waiting room somewhere in some media company with a CFAX screen, shows how long ago it was. And the number came up, and it was the 1 year number, which I thought was the 3 year number. Then I read the small print and said, that's the issue. And I felt, what has happened? Anyway, what had happened is the dot-com boom, blood going to people's heads, and the embarrassment of not winning something. This is the other thing, is about the dynamics of a bid. When people said they want to win rights, and there were 3 different rights up for grabs, which they were at the time. There was the Premier League, there was the FA, and there was the Football League almost at the same time. When ITV had lost out on the Premier League and lost out on the FA Cup, they chased it. Whereas actually what they should have said to us, no one else is bidding for this because the other guys have got the other stuff, so we should lower our bid. And that's exactly what I told them to do. I said, if Sky get the majority of the Premier League and get the FA Cup, lower your bid. They doubled it instead. And that's as a second lesson I'm going to go to, which is do not let your media client off the leash. If you basically are advising them, but they go into a dark room to say we're now going to decide what we're going to bid, that's a big red flashing light as an advisor, because they're going to ignore everything you say and just decide what they want to do, and that's when you get the blame but none of the control.
Well, there's two or three things in there that are just so important also for today. The context on digital, which I called ITV Digital, I think they changed their name at some point in those months, was this. They were a subsidiary of ITV, the big ITV PLC, or what ITV was at that point. I think there may have been a conglomerate of the two of them that were left, Carlton and Granada. I mean, I can't remember, but they had set up Newco, and Newco had offered what is the Football League a huge amount of money for rights that nobody thought was even possible. It was that specific bid that provoked me to say we should go as well, because these bidders are insane. When ITV Digital went bust in this period we're talking about, 2001, 2002, the whole world of football in England was around whether there were parent guarantees for the monies promised that could be reached out to the owners of On Digital, i.e. ITV, and they would be held good for the money. The fact is, as you say, they weren't. The legals on whether there was parent company guarantees, it became a very big legal case, and people were put on the stand to talk about it. And so one of the lessons clearly is get your legals right, especially when you are bidding high. And we've had some examples of that recently. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong here, when DAZN has walked away from a couple of recent league deals they've had, it has gone very legal very quickly. Part of that one for a second if you want. The second lesson from your story there is about what I call the difference in life between people looking for an excuse to say yes and people looking for an excuse to say no. Those two categories of people will use advisors to get to what they always wanted to do in the first place. And those people today are in the main called private equity. And they have been active in doing deals for media rights that are all over the place with CVC and others. And what happens sometimes is they'll ignore the advice given to, in your example, yourself back in the day with On Digital, or they go with advisors who they know will be as equally bullish as they want them to be, so that the deal can be signed off. Do you think that's fair, Mark, as an assessment to?
No, I would say that they're not as headstrong as media executives. I don't think there's much ego involved.
Okay.
I mean, there is ego in a sort of way, but they still have their investment committees. They have the red teams. They have people knocking it down. They've got much more internal challenge to bullshit. And I think they do. I mean, the approach we always took is just to make the whole model and the valuation as transparent as possible, so I can see how it's built up and we can discuss what is reasonable to believe and what may not be reasonable. So it's completely open to discussion about what's a reasonable point of view to take and what's a not reasonable point of view to take. In the end, I guess there is a kind of we have money to invest, we're going to invest it, but I wouldn't say they're as headstrong as media, and I think you'll find there are clauses in the contracts, some of those contracts, which can't be shared, which, the thing isn't as bad for them as it might appear. So
I get that they're first in, first out,
the recipients of the money who actually is being slightly naive about thinking the money will come in and everything will be right. So I'm not sure it's quite the same thing as the media companies.
Oh, no, for sure. It's for sure not the same, but yes, I take your point. They are smarter, they protect themselves better, but when you do have to deploy capital, I still believe they're looking to say yes and put a case together to do that. But the other thing I want to say about this, about timing, because this is the point you're making about timing. If you look, well, you're the person that would know this better than anybody, at when the step changes have taken place in, for example, the value of the EPL rights, it comes almost perfect correlation with the arrival of a challenger. And when the challenger arrives, it seems that all arithmetical and modelling numbering goes out the window and people start bidding based on strategic imperatives. I need to win it, but more importantly, they must not win it. And when you realise that, it obviously works in reverse as well. When that potential competitor has gone, you're really under pressure to maintain any kind of the valuations where you thought you were always going to go up. It can go down very quickly based on who's in the game and who's bidding and who's not bidding. And that would be considered the great skill of Richard Scudamore, that he had everybody believing that there was new bidders just round the corner waiting for him to say yes. Is that a fair assessment?
It is true. I think with a market-defining asset like the Premier League in the UK or cricket rights in India, there's always a sneaking suspicion that even though there isn't a rival around, it might be tempting for someone to enter the market because it effectively defines the market. You can shift the market. And I think at certain times when there's some transformation in the media, or as in the case of that, it was a telco market, I would disagree that the bidder just provides just strategic reasons that aren't logical. They are actually, because there are certain times in the affairs of man, if not taken at the flood, all that sort of stuff, where it is an opportunity to take a strategic move to change the market. Completely agree when that time passes, the market just goes back to normal and you get a big correction. But in the case of the BT challenge to Sky, there was a reason that BT entered the market, and it was because Sky had entered the broadband market. And because of convergence, because effectively TV was coming onto the web, the kind of streaming 1.0, TV and connectivity were intertwined. So the fact that people now got their TV or started to get their TV through the internet, through IP, meant that Sky decided it wanted to get into the broadband market, and also thought the broadband market was badly served in terms of customer service, etc. And they'd entered the broadband market very aggressively in terms of pricing, because they were basically saying, get broadband on top of TV and we'll deliver it to you. There's a regulatory background as well about the access they had to pay to BT's network, which is also changing. And BT was facing losing all its broadband customers in Sky Homes. So it had already lost quite a large amount of them. There was about 2 or 3 million to go. That effectively, if they didn't do anything, and what they had lots of options, but if they didn't do anything, they would see those 2 or 3 million households just disappear to Sky. And they were kind of some of the most valuable households because they're the higher income, sort of bigger broadband users. And they might not ever get them back again because it would be a bundled service. And that had a knock-on effect to the OpenReach platform beneath, because if someone gets a critical mass of users on an exchange, they can start to substitute the backhaul network and start to unwind your whole business. So there was an imperative. There was a kind of flashing light in BT's business. Of course, they had alternatives. They could have started by having a better service because, the fact their call centre was so, never got any answer and no one. They could also go into a price war. They could have gone into a price war. The problem about the price war, not only would they have a lot of pressure on their shares, but you probably couldn't confine the price war just to those Sky Homes because of the way the market works.
Of course, absolutely not.
And so it would be hugely costly. And also, if someone comes into your market and they have a high margin on their business and is giving away your product for free, probably the best thing to do is to respond by giving away their product for free, not giving away your product for free. So that's what led to the decision that let's go and buy some rights rather than a price reduction, which could cost us several billion, or indeed a huge marketing and service improvement campaign, which also could take 5 years and actually cost us several billion. Let's buy some sports rights. And so we could have a counter offer to them, which is you get our broadband, but you get the sport for free. That's the way we wanted to respond. And so there was a rational strategic move to stop Sky eating into BT's market. secondary to build a pay TV business, but actually it was that way around. It was primarily to stop.
Of course it was that way around.
Yeah.
Of course it was.
Because it was a counterfactual, because they did get some rights and they did actually put the brakes on Sky's market share. When you look at the incremental revenue, incremental cost, it looks bad because, of course, you never know what the revenue is they would have lost. So what you see is how much they spent versus the incremental revenue they got for selling TV packages or sports channels. And everybody says, oh, that was a big mistake. What you never see, and what the Chief Executive Board can never admit to, is if we hadn't bought those sports rights, we would have lost billions of pounds of broadband revenue. And that's why it's got payback. But it's like when you have to justify putting a new roof in your house, which doesn't actually increase the value. People say you're mad. But of course, what would have happened if you hadn't put a new roof in your house? But you could never want to admit that. So there's a slight issue about the way in which, especially public companies, have to justify their decisions and can never be quite as honest about why they have to invest to protect their market as they would like to be. But if you look at the payback on saving those 2 million homes, or most of them, it makes sense. But no one's ever seen that number because it's never been public.
But the point you're making is absolutely valid, and I think it's strengthened by what you've said in the last 5 minutes there. Sports rights holders, when they're trying to think about their tendering of their rights, the timing of it, they absolutely need to have an understanding of all these strategic elements as well. They need to understand what the objectives are of the bidder. And I think myself, one of the lessons I've learned over these 25 years is they don't really think that through. There's loads of examples out there just now about, what DAZN is going to do, for example, in my country here of Italy, because Sky Italia has decided that they're not going to be an aggressive bidder and there's nobody really anybody else. So what is DAZN going to do in the wider idea of them maybe getting into sport and entertainment? That's just one example. You need to think what Paramount is going to do now that they've bought Warner Brothers, and all of these elements about what does my potential bidder really want from my rights. I don't think that is ever really talked about a lot in the boardrooms of sports rights holders. No,
there's a grand game of media and tech going on, and you're the small change, right? So if you don't understand the timing of that and what they're trying to do, you can get your timing wrong, you can get your valuations very wrong. I mean, roll forward on the BT Sky, is that war happened. BT did put the brakes on compared to what would have happened. But at some point, there were diminishing returns to that. And Sky also wanted to sue for peace. So there was a truce coming. And one of the best advice we gave to the Football League when we were advising them was there was a truce coming because it made sense in game theory terms that there was now time to sue for peace.
Theory.
And if you didn't get your rights before the truce, you would get a much worse deal. Because the truce took the form of, we promised that you can have our channel at this price if you promise we can have your channel, mutual carriage. And a mutual carriage deal at certain prices takes the heat out of the market completely because you're going to get the rights.
And that isn't understood in our industry. All the times I'm speaking to clients and thinking about tenders and everything, like the idea of access or mutual carriage, whatever you want to call it, is such a fundamental point. If a bidder can be sitting there saying, look, I don't need to bid high because worst case scenario, I'm going to get it anyway through the carriage deal. That takes all the heat out of it. And one of the things we're going to talk about over these podcasts is exactly, the thinking that is going to have to happen these days around mutual carriage. And mutual carriage now isn't just the one you talked about. What are we seeing now, Mark, with a lot of broadcasters putting their content on YouTube? That's another version of it, and it's just getting incredibly complex. One of the things, I don't know whether it's on one of your lessons that you've got in 30 years, but it's certainly mine. And it's quite a recent lesson because it reflects the changes in the media market, and at least in my view, that Streaming isn't as profitable as the old bundle cable model was. Marginality isn't high, so everybody's much more focused on bang for buck in terms of where they spend their programming budgets, and sport is part of that. The idea that a broadcaster now will not pay for the same audience twice. And I think that is poorly understood. And as I say, I've only really got focus on that in the last few years. A good example of that is exactly the one I mentioned before. Why is Sky Italia not interested in Serie A anymore? Well, the reason is they've taken the view that they've got that audience covered with the EPL and the Champions League. And when they say, and they do the numbers and they say, well, of course we will have churn if we don't have Serie A, because Serie A is Serie A, and a football fan needs to follow that passion of their club. And they say, yeah, we will lose, but how many will we lose? Because that man who follows Serie A is part of a family where the woman is also following MasterChef or X Factor and all the big formats that are in the entertainment world. And we are offering football, Champions League, and Juventus are going to be likely in the Champions League, AC Milan, and we are offering the wonderful EPL. I don't think our churn's going to be that high, and we're going to bid low for Serie A, and that's what they did, and they've never come back. And that isn't well understood, Mark, in my opinion, in the industry.
No, it's not. And the big lesson, what they took the lesson from was in France, before the current demise, was when Canal Plus had a package of Liga rights, but not the whole lot. They'd actually bought the package off beIN. And Canal Plus actually did reasonably well not having all those Liga rights, because they had Champions League and they had Rugby 14, top 14. And that gave everybody a lesson. You can do without, if not all of the top league, a large part of it. And that everybody looked at that and thought, aha. And of course, it is a moving target, because the comparative popularity of domestic leagues and Champions League has been moving. It's been moving in two ways. The Champions League's got bigger, and also the domestic leagues in many countries have become dominated and boring. And so as soon as you invert, which is the most important asset and which is the second asset, your starting point of who do we get the subscriber first with, and then everybody else is incremental, changes. So it used to be the top league was the starting point, and everything else was valued on incremental. Who do we get added by having this? As soon as the Champions League gets its head above the domestic league, the thing inverts. And so it's the Champions League is first. The domestic has to justify itself of who it brings as well as the Champions League. And so you get a big shift in value. It's not proportionate, it's exponential. Because the whole curve of rights values in any market is exponential. The most popular asset usually gets at least twice the second and twice the third. And in some it's even more exponential. So, and that's all driven by the relative ranking, not just of people's preferences, but people who like both, which one do they prefer the two they like? And if you get a shift in that, just quite small shifts, or which is the lead asset, then the value switches. And it can switch quite drastically. And that's why I would say that most countries, the Champions League is undervalued, and the domestic league, compared to historically, is overvalued. And going forward, and it's not just a kind of linear thing, it's a kind of switch. In some countries less than others. I mean, the Premier League is still a good product, a powerful product in England and the UK. But in France, definitely. I mean, that inversion happened 5 or 6 years ago, and it's actually that bit of research that got us to tell the Ligue 1 that their numbers were more like to go down than up, to which we were shown the door.
Well, you see, that's it, isn't it? To which we were shown the door. You know, I'm not anywhere near as an expert like you are, but I've got good gut sense and radar. And when people were saying Ligue 1 is going to go for $1 billion, I couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe that, Mark. And then when you see financial investors buy that story, okay, and I take your point that maybe their deal is smart and they won't be hurt as much as the league. I take that point, but they still made one hell of a misjudgment. Mark, is one of the lessons that you've learned over these years that sport is perhaps a little bit rude and arrogant and doesn't want to hear the guy in the corner telling them how it's going to be?
Yeah, absolutely. If I'd say that, I think, not to betray too much, the investor did not base their investment on that number. They took a more conservative view of what the future was. So I think if you work back through the deal, it wasn't based on that number. They didn't believe that number either. We were advising them and they didn't believe that number. So don't be reassured they did not believe that number, whether the league was saying. And of course, if a league went off and achieved it, great, because our upside is even greater. But it wasn't. The return was not based on that number. So I wouldn't. I think that the sport itself can be arrogant, and I think hopefully one of the effects of investors in sport post deal is that there'll be a slightly more calming, rational voice in the room about what can be achieved, and actually force some of those sports to address some of the more structural issues they need to address to get the number back up again. Rather than just crossing your fingers and hoping the cavalry come over the hill and offer you more money, because that's not going to happen. So I think although, investors may have been slightly optimistic, I think they're quite quick to say, look, things have changed. We've got to change quickly. You cannot just hope for the next number to go up. You have to start doing things. And
but Mark, we see all these brochures. We see all these brochures. I get one a day from consultants or experts on the sector. And that curve looks all the same, up and to the right, without exception. So you can't tell me that everybody's all of a sudden got with the program and knows what it is. I genuinely believe, Mark, and it's one of the things we probably disagree on, that there is a deep necessity and desire for people to buy the bull story. Where even in this hour that we're talking, we've shown some examples where it just isn't the case.
No, I think there are lots of examples now that isn't the case, especially if you take a look at the real value of rights rather than the nominal value, given inflation in the last few years. That we're in a situation where very few things get real increases. So I think the sports themselves don't want to believe there's an inflection point, but inflection points there will be, there are some reasons for big sports where the number never goes through the floor. Liga is an exception, because thinking back to 2003, where Sky was the only bidder for the Premier League rights, they could have reduced their bid by 50%, but they only reduced it by 10% because they knew the clubs would go bankrupt if they. Now it would seem that Canal Plus has no qualms about Liga and clubs going bankrupt. Maybe they think the French government will intervene or be some other intervention, but certainly one of Sky's concerns in 2003 is if we put the brakes on too much, we're not going to have a product to sell. They're going to be selling their players, etc. So there is a kind of long-term interest, and that's actually about long-term partnerships. Because Sky kind of took the view, we started the Premier League, we did the first deal, and we stuck by them for 10 years. I'm going to stick by them. There was a kind of thing that, this is ours, and we won't want to ruin it. And in a sense, because we're an incumbent, they're always going to choose us as long as our bid is somewhere near someone else's bid. They're not going to turf us out completely. Now, I think that kind of mutuality between the Premier League and Sky was understood. And the fact that Sky stood by it in 2003 probably meant the 2006 auction and 2009 auctions, where Setanta were the only rival, was partly, everybody knew that Sky was going to get the rights. There was a regulatory requirement that they couldn't get all the rights, as you remember. No thing about it. You could argue that by 2011, when BT came in, that loyalty was less enduring and the clubs wanted more money. But I think there is something about Sky standing by sports. I think rugby league had that for a long time. And one of the rugby league's problems was the Sky having created the Super League, and a lot of Australians in Sky having created the Super League.
Yes.
Unfortunately, all Australians had left, so half the people at Sky don't understand what rugby league is. That's being unfair, but you know what I mean?
Yes, I do.
The loyalty to rugby league, which had actually changed its whole season to suit the Sky schedule, had disappeared. But that lasted for quite a long time. The rugby league is ours, and we have a mutual duty to help it. But when that runs out, it's quite brutal.
It is. The thing that, again, we all have our own experiences, rude and arrogant sport remember my own experience in the SPL. Sky, I think, decently bid the same amount for our rights for the new tender, where they were the only game in town and they could have basically done but my clubs reacted so badly to that. I was told, using an expletive, to go back to Sky and tell them where to stick it. And I just think there's a lack of sophistication, like we've talked about so far on this podcast, but there's also a little bit of arrogance. We are sport, we are rugby, we are football, they can't do without us. Well, yes, they can, especially in this world now where viewing habits are different and everything like that. One of my lessons of the last 25 years, and it's not anything special, it's just the short-termism of sport is overwhelming, Mark. And I think this is the thing that frustrates me a little bit. There's a lot of sports that aren't in the top premier rank that are going to have to look at alternative models, and all those alternative models in some way involve things like YouTube or specifically YouTube. And I'm thinking of an example like women's football in the UK. What's it called? WSL. They started off on YouTube and they were singing the benefits of that, and aren't we great and aren't we innovative. Didn't take an awful big bid from Sky, I think it was, for them to sell their rights and put them behind a paywall for a sport that one could argue that was the last thing it needed to restrict its audience behind a paywall. The short-termism and the total blindness to anything other than a check left on the table, and I just don't see any optimism that that's going to change. I don't see any way that people are thinking, oh, I'm going to play a medium, longer-term game. I'm going to make sure that I grow my sport. The check will always dominate. And if that's the case, I'm really worried, Mark, about what's going to happen.
Yeah, of course, a lot of the need to pounce on the check is to do with the financial health or otherwise of the sport. Obviously, a lot of what's going on in football is about the player costs and the need to keep the show on the road.
Of course it is. Yep.
So that's another issue. In other sports, it's more about the obligations of the sporting body to fund the whole pyramid. That means that there are a lot of hungry chicks with their mouths open who vote you on or vote you off committees, and you need to keep them fed. So it's less the players, it's more the stakeholders in the system who all need
so
to be fed, which means you take the check just to keep them off your back and to be voted in next time. And that's their political systems, they're not businesses. So the pressure is different why they take the check. So what I'm saying is part of the answer of that is they need a different constitution. They need to have a different way of running their sport, which gives them more headroom to deny the check and to go for longer term business building. Now, of course, third-party capital was supposed to do that. But of course, once it comes in, they also want the return. So the terms on which you get the third-party capital and the plan they sign up to is pretty important. Otherwise, you end up with just the same pressure to get the check in the door to pay off the promised business plan to the investor. So I think they need to build more headroom into the strategy about giving themselves time to transfer the business from being too media rights dependent to being more dependent, or getting other revenue streams and other sources of revenue and building the sport for a more equal kind of exploitation strategy. And they should be using capital to do that, patient capital. But patient capital is something that's hard to get, as we know. It's a big issue. And ironically, the people who would probably give it patient capital are media companies. Because media companies would have an interest in building sports themselves and owning part of that sport because they have a long-term interest in it. And maybe that's where sports end up. You can argue that some of what's happened with UFC, etc. That's
exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. is about the person who owns the whole ecosystem, including the media rights, etc., is the person who's got the patience to build a sport.
Which in this case is David Ellison and Jerry Cardinale, etc.
Yeah, and maybe they're the better people because in the end you need the whole kind of value chain ecosystem to be patient, and that's probably the way through is control more of your ecosystem, get patient capital that has a long-term interest in creating a business on top of your sport. And that's where to go. But of course, ironically, in many countries, the one company not allowed to own a sport is a media company.
Yep, these are the lessons of our last 30 years, and we're still in the same place. But what are the main themes, Mark, that you think we'll touch over the next year?
The most obvious one is the question mark. Media rights are stalling. We'll come back to the why is the US slightly different, but media rights are stalling. Is that cyclical? Or is it structural? If it is structural, is there any way through that, or does one have to completely adjust the way one sees the future of one's sport? I think it's people are quite confused. I mean, yes, the worst of them were deluded, but the best of them were confused. And let's talk about the best, because media is going through a massive transformation, and it's changing the economics of media quite dramatically, bringing in tech platforms, etc. And so it's very hard to say what's going to happen in the next 5 or 6 years. The old certainty is the pay TV providers, the big checks, the telcos came in and left again. Where's the next cavalry coming from? Is a complicated question about the dynamics of the media and tech industries. And the timing of it, as you say, is almost as important as whether it happened or not. So I think that's one of the big issues, is people's view about the slowdown. Obviously, buyers may be quite welcoming the slowdown.
But Mark, let me argue against my own thesis here. Is it not the case that we've got enough evidence, whether it's the NBA recent deals or what the NFL believe they can do in the renegotiation coming up in the next 12 months, even smaller little examples like in Norway where they shouted from the rooftops how great they had renewed their rights. Is there not enough data points to suggest that everything is going to be rosy in the garden?
No. I think there's an issue about the US being different. We'll come back to that. I think a Norwegian deal, from my numbers, because people announce 5-year deals and they do the kind of annual payment compared to the last 5 years. You've got to remember that that's quite a long period. So if you work backwards, you've got basically a CAGR of 2%. That's nominal. So that's actually below the Norwegian inflation rate. So it's standing still, right? It's not a disaster, but it's standing still. And yes, they did do a good deal just to stand still, but that tells its own story, right? America is different because some of the increase, although remember in America, they do 7 to 10 year deals. So you take the midpoint in one deal and the midpoint in another deal. And it sounds like a big number. When you work out the 7-year or 10-year CAGR, it's not quite as dramatic as it looks.
Damn lies and statistics. But
yes,
take the point. They look like big numbers.
The CAGRs are well above inflation. So it is true they're achieving that. Firstly, the American media market, at every level, is more competitive than the European markets. In European markets, it's usually 1.5, 2.5 bidders. And if one of them kind of goes to sleep, you've got a problem. In America, you've still got 4 networks. And by rules, no one can know more than
networks, you mean terrestrial networks?
Terrestrial networks, the old-fashioned broadcast networks. You've still got, you've got a pay TV market, which although is in decline, it's still got a lot of profit in it. And you've got streamers where it's their home market. And you've got a lot of streamers still existing. And just the media market is a lot bigger proportionally, even than the economy. It's a bigger marketing market in terms of advertising to GDP ratio, to income. And it's a bigger entertainment spend market. People's entertainment spend per head is high. So these markets, these are all subject to scale economies. So you've got a market that's subject to scale economies, which is actually almost is bigger than even the bigger US economy as a media market, etc. So there's a lot more value in the system to keep the number growing. Now, that's not to say that if if streamers merge, if networks get into more financial problems, if there's consolidation, if the top line number of the American consumer isn't growing by as much, and if the advertising dollars aren't growing because America moves into a slower growth period, that number won't again come down and the growth level. But the American economy, as we know, is a more dynamic economy. The underlying growth rate is higher.
Much higher, yep.
And its propensity to spend on entertainment and advertising is higher still. And that allows a lot of rivals into the market and who can still be profitable. So the whole economics on the demand side is completely different.
That's not well understood, and it should be.
Yeah, and when you get to the specifics of the free-to-air market, the free-to-air market in the States is completely different from, there's 4 people at hammer and tongs against each other, and the economics of the US network, the amount of advertising they pull in from having a major sports right, the halo effect it has is bigger, and there's a whole local station network relationship and transmission fees, which we don't have anywhere else in Europe, which is that the local stations are going to demand fees from the cable companies, a retransmission fee. And the networks themselves, every few years, have to convince the stations to remain affiliates, independent stations. All that is a link to their ownership of major sports rights. So it's even more baked in to your position as a network and your economics to win sports rights. And that is very different from most European free-to-air networks, where obviously often you're lucky to get 2 competing free-to-air networks interested in your rights.
Maybe there's only one.
Usually one free-to-air network.
Yeah. You said something there that's just so interesting, and this is going to be so common in this podcast. You know, the American market is one market. It's hence much bigger, whereas we in Europe, I'm talking about Europe, continue to organise our sport on national geographical borders, and people refuse to understand how limiting that is in terms of what you've just explained, what you can do in a bigger market. One of the reasons I've always been in favour of something like the Super League, apart from the whole dynamics about wage caps and everything else, not for this podcast, is just it's a bigger media market and you can get more competition and you can get a better return on the investment that you make. So, as you say, Mark, extrapolating good headline numbers in America and saying everything is great, I think that's an error, but I think it's an error a lot of financial investors are making, and they're just saying Europe should be higher value, just like America is, and, you know, happy days, we can get in there. I think that's a big error, and we've seen that for 5 years. Yeah, on you go.
The comment you make about, and the broader context about European single market, and the comment you make about the football asset itself being pan-European is one thing, and then there's the media markets being pan-European.
But one follows the other, I think.
Well, it does.
I think.
The work we've done, and we've done this for consortium of content owners in Europe at the European Commission level, is that if you did actually ban territorial rights in Europe, and you basically said there has to be a pan-European, leave aside the UK, but the pan-European right, when you work it through in terms of the pricing in different markets and how it works its way through, it's more likely that the total spend on content will go down, but the top content will get a higher proportion of it. So the polarization effect gets even worse if you go to pan-European rights.
It's inevitable, my friend. It's inevitable. It's an entertainment market that is big event, big celebrity, big influencer numbers. I'm afraid, I believe we're kinky now if we're just trying to hold that back. But that will be one of the themes about redistribution, because one of the things that our American friends do have on that kind of basis is that they rebalance in other methods, whether it's the draft or everything like that. We continue to not do that, and our leagues are getting ever more, as you said earlier, dominated by one winner or a couple of teams. And that leads
into a current debate. As you know, the NFL is trying to defend themselves. There's a case being caught against the NFL because everybody sees the NFL's got lots of pricing power. The media companies led by Murdoch are challenging their ability to negotiate collectively.
Yep.
Because it comes from a constitutional opt-out, or which basically says for free-to-air broadcasters, they have the right to negotiate collectively. It doesn't necessarily apply to other broadcasts, and that's going to be challenged. And that goes back to when we were together. The other thing going on in the marketplace in 1999 to 2002 was the European Commission challenging the league's rights to sell rights collectively, as you remember. And big clubs, and this probably influenced the old firm as well, big clubs thinking they were going to get their own rights back because they wouldn't be allowed.
Yes.
And there is there's a link between the solidarity of sports, the redistribution of revenue, and their ability and being allowed to negotiate collectively. One of the reasons collective licensing was kind of allowed in Europe was because the money was being used for a broader public purpose to create competitive balance.
Yep.
Now, of course, if that's no longer happening, then the main reason you're allowed to collectively negotiate is if you start to not share out the revenue equally, falls away. So the whole ability of leagues to collectively negotiate will come into question if you start to unpick the way the revenue is shared.
I had that as one of my themes, antitrust looming. I think I did a Sunday column about that just before the end of last year. I think
when prices go up,
yeah,
antitrust comes in. I mean, we remember, you're from the music industry.
Yeah.
The big issue in the music industry before Napster was CD prices being too high.
Yep.
And in that sense, the music industry just asked for it because they were increasing their prices all the time, and the
Sounds
cost of
familiar,
converting your music library was enormous. And they were asking for trouble, and in the end, Napster came along rather than the European competition authorities and destroyed that business model. But I think, the last days of trying to extract more revenue usually end up in some kind of antitrust challenge. But often the market solves the antitrust problem before the regulators get around to intervene.
Normally it does, normally. Another big theme for me anyway, Mark, over this coming year is this whole idea of regular season versus post-season or playoffs or whatever you want to call it, oversupply compared to the scarcity of the big event that really matters.
Sports always go for increased output. It's the easiest thing to do, and it ruins the product in the end. You see it all over the place.
But now they seem to be, again, whether you say delusional or confused, I also will go for confused. They seem to not understand another thing that is blindingly obvious for me, which is for these 30 years that we've talked about since we've known each other, the product has been, in the main, exclusivity of IP of the 90 minutes of a football game or the 80 minutes of a rugby game. I think for the first time in the last 5 years, we need to ask whether that's the product anymore, when viewing habits of younger audiences are not like that, where the viewing preferences or the buying preferences of people like Netflix and Amazon may not be that interested in week in, week out regular season. I don't think we've talked about that enough as an industry. More supply, more tournaments, it'll all be all right on the night. And, we're going to have to talk this through with all the guests that come on, because I think we're going to get hit in the backside very hard by that. This idea of the principle of scarcity, bidders wanting just big events, and younger people not really being up for watching 90 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's another dynamic going on. Consumption trends, social trends in consumption. I think the answer to that isn't quite as simple as we need to be on YouTube. I think there are issues about how you're on YouTube, and there are issues about that end market and whether they're ever going to pay, whether their clients, their customers, the people, will ever see a premium in it, or whether their advertisers will ever see a premium in it, or indeed whether those markets will ever get competitive enough for them to compete for the rights show. Because at the moment, everybody's on YouTube because that's the only place to go, right?
Yep.
If there were two rivals YouTubes, you might get someone offering you some money up front rather than just a share of revenue. And that's not happening, whether there's value in the system or not, but you need competition for that value to be handed over.
Correct.
And a lot of these tech platforms are quasi-monopolies in their own market segment. Like Amazon has come into the sports rights market, and it's bought rights that actually drive its Amazon Prime business.
Of course, it's not
which
interesting.
is mostly about pre-Christmas sales, etc. Once they've signed them up, they often drop the rights because they've done the business. If Amazon had a rival, they wouldn't be able to drop the rights because the rival would pick them up. And one of the problems is that if they're a monopoly in their own kind of business model, then they're never going to be a sustained substitution for the traditional TV rights. You need not just the value to be in there, but you need competition for that value.
What you're saying there in plain man or woman's English is this. If Amazon wants to get more Prime customers, Amazon Prime, their main business, from baseball fans, they will pick up a little package of baseball rights. They will suck out the people there to get them over to be buying stuff on Amazon. They know that people very rarely switch out from buying their batteries and their shoes on Amazon. The sport has done its function and it can be dropped as no longer useful. That's
Correct.
What you're saying.
But if Walmart was, and in America, Walmart is a bit of a comparator to Amazon, if Walmart decided actually the way to reduce Amazon's market power was actually for us to get some sports rights, you suddenly get comparative environment. But, at least in America, you've got Amazon versus Walmart.com. Who is the nearest e-commerce rival to Amazon in the UK? I mean, there are e-commerce platforms, but they're not the same thing as a D2C actual rival. And that's part of the problem. If they don't have a rival, then you can't get the value from them, even starting with the fact there's less value in that system, maybe. You're never going to see it because they don't need to give it to you. All Amazon are doing is saying, how much money do we have to give them for them to carve out a package for us and not feel that they're losing any money from the other bidders? That's very different from how much money you have to give them to stop it getting to our e-commerce rival. That would be a very different discussion.
Absolutely.
And the analogy is that, BT, the convergence of telecom and TV was what brought BT into the market. And for the first time since sort of 1997, Sky had a serious rival. And that was because BT came into someone from outside the industry came into their market. But until that point, the telecom market and the TV market were separate. So there was no real competition. BT might bid for a few mobile rights or some clip rights for its mobile, but it was never going to come in to compete for the main rights because they weren't in the same market. So a lot of this is tied to whether the tech platforms in the end will be competitive with each other. And Netflix move into a YouTube market is very encouraging for rights holders, because if Netflix wants to move into the YouTube market, which
you mean
it looks
the creator
like,
market that YouTube currently has just now?
The kind of we are a platform where you can get a large range of content. Suddenly, YouTube's got a rival for its audience, and it's just the same for music and Spotify. Where's the rival? You need a rival, and that's interesting. If they start to nudge at each other's markets, that becomes interesting, because I'm not saying the numbers will be the same, but it's a much more interesting conversation.
And YouTube is rumoured to be interested in those 5 NFL games or whatever it is, and that's a direct result of that. Obviously, one of the big themes over this podcast will be exactly all of this stuff you've just mentioned. Another thing that I would love to get into, being really at the end of the day a finance guy, is to understand the economics of these media companies. Questions like, well, where now Comcast? Does ESPN sit within Disney? And if so, how? How the hell can Paramount think that it's got a business model paying all this money for rights? And, looking at the share price of these big companies, looking at the yield on their debt of these big companies, the terrestrial people. I just think it's a fascinating moment for anybody that's got an interest. And I always say to sports people, look at the health of your banker, and your banker is the media companies. And I bet none of you could tell me whether the share price of Comcast has gone up or gone down in the last 12 months, because you don't care. And you should care. You really should care.
Absolutely. And then beyond that, well, what's the total revenue in this system? What's the total profit in this system? Because and how much of that profit is going to debt holders, and rather than into operations, and into content. And those big numbers matter. In the bigger issue about the great content boom, that was the TV content boom, not sports. The golden era of scripted content, which has come to an end. I mean, we did quite a lot of work about what was sustaining that boom and what would bring it to an end. Quite a lot of macro work about about what was leading to their increased spending on content, how much of that was over-optimism about business plan, how much of that was the sheer amount of profit in the US TV system, which meant that a more competitive streaming market had a lot of money to actually spend on content to win market share. Because people forget the profit margins of an average Discovery channel were 50%, right? The profit margins of the cable system carrying them was also 50%. So an enormous amount. So we once did that 500 billion was the value of the global TV industry. And partly because the economics of America, only 200 billion goes into content. So where was the other 300 billion going, right? That it was going to the carriage intermediaries and the broadcasters' profit lines. A lot of that in the US. That's a lot of money that can be going to content in a more competitive industry that can fuel a boom. But of course, when the boom comes to an end, when there's no more profit to squeeze, then suddenly it comes to a juddering halt. And that's we did a lot of work on that.
The analysis of margins is, that was my line. This current media sector just doesn't have high marginality like it used to have. But one of the things that we'll end this first pilot, because this has been great. But one of the things that I want to ask on these series is something like this. Comcast for certainly in Europe is Sky Italy, Sky Germany no longer. That's my point. Now sold, and Sky UK. A big question, is there any possible future for a sport-only pay TV broadcaster, or do you have to integrate really enormously with entertainment? And obviously I'm alluding to DAZN there, and they've started to do that a little bit in Australia. These are things that feed into margins, the ability to the whole financial side of how the media sector works. I'd love to investigate that with you in the next 12 months, Mark.
No, I think that's very important, and you're right. Can a sport-only service have enough revenue base, enough margin to compete with bundle platforms that have a lot more they're offering to consumers? I mean, I once wrote in print that DAZN's business, and this is about 6 years ago, DAZN's business plan makes sense if you believe sports rights are going to go down. And they have in some markets,
wow.
So it does start to make sense. And in fact, it may be a long road to DAZN turning around to sports owners and saying, let's do a joint venture. Let's do this business together. They did a bit
like
of that
the country
Japan.
I reside in today. Like the country I reside in today in Italy, it seems an obvious one for me.
So that brings you back to the media company and the sport get together, and that may be the best long-term strategy for a sport to adopt. Now, of course, the terms on which they come together is all important. Yeah. But if you want patient capital to build a sport, you want a media partner who's got an interest in building your sport. And it may be when you give up the narcotic that is the big check and realise it's not coming, that's exactly what you look at. And maybe that was DAZN's game plan all along. I'm not saying it was, but that was a credible way through. They came into the market when the rights were still quite high, but on the notion that they couldn't stay that high. And eventually they get low and more sports would come to it wanting to do joint ventures. That's a credible way through it. It still doesn't answer the question, will they always lose out to a more diversified bundle entertainment player who can nibble away at their hold on rights, even if they're not going to offer much more for it, they can offer a bit more. And that's a battle that DAZN's going to have to prepare for. How much can they keep hold of their rights by offering lower fee or no increased fee, more joint ventures? And how much will the Paramounts of this world, or even the Amazons or Apple of this world, come in and spoil that story? Or indeed, will Amazon and Paramount also buy DAZN because they want to get their hands on sports?
Well, let's not discuss that now, but it absolutely is one of the themes, the corporate activity around the media sector. The Paramount deal has kept us all awake, and the to and fro's from the opening bid, I think it was $7 to what it was settled at $31. That's what happens in finance and in media, as we talked about at the very start. Mark, thanks for this. I think that's a great way for us to kick off Citizen AYNE. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we will be back with a marquee guest for the first real show in a few weeks' time.
let's hear from them. You've heard enough from us, so let's hear from them.
Thanks to everybody for listening, and thanks to 54 for making this possible.